Julia Robertson didn't seem like someone who could vanish. At 29 years old, she had a steady job, a close-knit circle of friends, and a modest but well-kept apartment on the outskirts of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Her life wasn't flashy, but it was rooted. She loved puzzles, iced coffee, even in winter, and volunteered twice a month at a women's crisis center. She was the kind of person others relied on, not someone you'd expect to become the center of a missing persons investigation. And yet, on a rainy evening in October 2016, Julia didn't show up for a scheduled volunteer shift. She didn't call in. She didn't text. By midnight, her phone went straight to voicemail. The next morning, her supervisor tried her again. Nothing. When Julia didn't show up for work that Monday, a co-worker drove to her apartment. The front door was locked. Her car was still in the parking lot. But Julia was nowhere to be found. What followed was a string of frustrating and chilling discoveries. Her apartment was undisturbed, keys on the counter, half a cup of coffee still warm in the microwave. No signs of forced entry, no sign of a struggle. Her wallet and driver's license were missing, but her phone was on the kitchen table, wiped clean of data. Her laptop was still logged into her email, with her last message sent 2 nights before she vanished. She had RSVP'd to a friend's engagement party. Nothing in her digital footprint suggested she was planning to leave. Police were baffled. Her family was devastated. Julia's mother, Claire, held daily vigils and pleaded with local news outlets to keep her daughter's story in the public eye. Flyers went up across Michigan. The case reached national missing person networks. Anonymous tips came in from as far as New Jersey and Nevada, but none panned out. Days turned into weeks. The hope that Julia had simply walked away on her own began to fade. In late November, with no solid leads, the Grand Rapids Police Department publicly announced they were treating the case as a potential foul play investigation. Behind the scenes, however, detectives were stuck in limbo. There were no financial records indicating travel, no surveillance footage showing her leaving town. Nothing to anchor a timeline after the night she disappeared. But the strangest detail, Julia had no history of mental illness, no previous disappearances, no dramatic relationship breakups. She had been planning to visit her niece for Halloween, the very weekend she vanished. She had already bought the costume. It didn't make sense, and that was the most unsettling part of all. The trail had gone cold. By early 2017, it had been over 4 months since Julia Robertson vanished from her apartment without a trace. Her friends were exhausted. Her mother looked 10 years older, and the police were quietly starting to refer to the case as a probable long-term unresolved. But miles away from Grand Rapids, in a weather-worn women's shelter tucked in the outskirts of Minneapolis, a new resident arrived in early March. She called herself Rachel Connors. She had no state ID, no social security card. She claimed to be 30, said she had recently escaped an abusive relationship, and showed signs of stress, sleep disturbances, hypervigilance, and long pauses when asked simple questions. But none of that raised red flags. Shelters often encounter women in trauma. What made Rachel unusual was her caution. She refused intake photographs, she declined therapy, and she never allowed staff to copy her fingerprints, even though the shelter worked closely with a re-employment program that required background checks. She kept to herself, spoke very little, and stayed indoors most days. She had no visitors, no phone, no social media. She volunteered for kitchen duty and quietly cleaned the bathrooms. She didn't cause problems, but she also never truly connected with anyone. She existed in the background. But one caseworker couldn't shake the feeling something was off. Her name was Denise, and she'd worked in shelters for over a decade. She'd seen dozens of women like Rachel, women in pain, women fleeing violence, women hiding from the world. But Rachel wasn't just hiding. It was like she was disappearing in real time. Denise noticed how she avoided mirrors, how she flinched when anyone mentioned family. And then one afternoon, as she was organizing the shelter's storage room, Denise found something. A flyer, torn, crumpled, and stuck to the bottom of a box of winter coats. It was a missing person bulletin for Julia Robertson. Denise froze. She stared at the photo. Something about the eyes, the shape of the mouth, the tired, distant expression. It wasn't conclusive, but it was enough to send chills down her spine. She didn't say anything, not at first, but she quietly made a call to the Grand Rapids police tip line. She faxed over a copy of the shelter's intake logs. A detective named Eric Donnelly picked up the case. He had been part of the original investigation, and he remembered Julia's file. He remembered everything. Within 72 hours, he was on a plane to Minneapolis, armed with a court order and a fingerprint kit. The staff agreed to cooperate. Rachel was in the common room when Detective Donnelly arrived. She didn't run. She didn't protest. She simply stood still as he approached, her eyes fixed on the floor. "You don't have to say anything," he said, "but I think I know who you are." The test was quick. 10 minutes later, the prints came back. Match. Julia Robertson, missing for nearly 14 months, had been found. But the discovery would only raise more questions than answers. When Julia Robertson sat down with the detectives for the first time, she didn't say much. Not at first. She wore the same faded sweatshirt from the shelter and wrapped her arms tightly around herself, as if even a threadbare hoodie could protect her from what was coming. Her eyes stayed downcast, voice barely audible. But when she finally began to speak, what unfolded was a story no one, not even her family, had imagined. Julia hadn't been kidnapped. She hadn't been trafficked. She'd left on purpose. But it wasn't rebellion, and it wasn't madness. It was survival. She described a private hell no one knew she'd been living in. For nearly 2 years before her disappearance, Julia had been in a relationship that looked perfect on the outside. Smiles in public, clean-cut boyfriend, family barbecues, but behind closed doors, it was suffocating. He was controlling, charming to others, cruel in private. The kind of man who made her feel like she was always the problem. Gaslighting, isolation, threats, not with fists, but with silence, with shame. Slowly, he cut off her ties. First her old friends, then her brother, then her mother. Everything Julia did was monitored. Every phone call, every dollar spent, every movement. She wasn't allowed to work. He told her she wasn't capable, that no one else would ever want her. She tried to leave. Once, packed a bag, and got as far as the bus station. But he found her. And when he did, he didn't hit her. He just whispered, "You leave again, and I'll make sure no one ever finds you, not even your own mother." She believed him. So instead, she did something else. She disappeared before he could make her vanish for real. She waited for a day when he'd be out of town. She destroyed her phone, left her ID, her bank cards, her laptop, took only cash, walked to the freeway and caught a ride with a trucker heading south. She didn't have a destination, just a promise to herself. Wherever I land, I'll be someone new. That's how Rachel Connors was born. She picked the name out of a thrift store romance novel and held onto it like armor. In each new city, she worked for cash, slept in shelters, scrubbed dishes, avoided cameras, She wasn't running from the law. She was running from the feeling that she didn't own her own life. For the first few months, it felt like freedom. Then it started to feel like exile. But by the time she was found in Minneapolis, something had changed. Julia wasn't broken. She was cautious, yes, guarded. But she had grown into a quiet kind of resilience. A woman who had been stripped of everything, but had managed to rebuild a version of herself no one could touch. And yet, there was a question hovering over it all. Why didn't she ever call home? Her answer stunned the room. Because I didn't want them to talk me out of it. I knew if I heard my mum's voice, I'd go back. And I wasn't ready to be Julia again. When her mother was informed Julia had been found alive, she didn't ask why. She just cried. But when the reunion finally happened, it wasn't a tearful embrace at the airport. Julia requested something quieter, a meeting room with just her mother and no cameras. She said she needed to meet her mum again, as Rachel, not as Julia, as the woman she had become, not the girl she used to be. Claire Robertson agreed, and when she saw her daughter walk into that room, thinner, older, and far more guarded than she remembered, she didn't ask questions. She simply opened her arms and whispered, "Welcome home, in any name you choose." But Julia's journey wasn't over, because going missing is one thing. Coming back is something else entirely. Julia Robertson's return to Michigan didn't come with fireworks. There was no parade, no press conference, no heartfelt reunion caught live on national television. It was quiet, intentional, and very, very complicated. After being found alive in a Minneapolis shelter under the alias Rachel Connors, Julia agreed to return home, but under one condition: no cameras, no reporters, and no public spectacle. She didn't want her face plastered across headlines. She didn't want to be a miracle found. She wanted privacy, healing, and time to figure out what home even meant after everything she had been through. But that didn't stop the story from getting out. A week after her reappearance, a local news outlet broke the story. Michigan woman missing for 14 months, found alive in Minnesota shelter. And from there, it spread like wildfire. National outlets picked it up. Social media ran with it. People were captivated by the idea of a woman just vanishing, only to reappear a year later under a different name. Theories exploded. Some praised her for surviving, others questioned her intentions. Why didn't she call sooner? Why lie about her identity? Was it even legal? But behind the noise was a deeper, more unsettling truth. Most people had no idea what it actually meant to return after vanishing. Julia wasn't just stepping back into her old life. That life no longer existed. Her apartment had been rented to someone else. Her job had been filled. Her bank account had been closed. Even her driver's license had been flagged as inactive, presumed deceased. She was a ghost, returning to a world that had moved on. And emotionally, it was worse. Some friends didn't know what to say. Others avoided her altogether. A few questioned if her story was even real. But the biggest hurdle wasn't the public. It was herself. She had spent over a year as Rachel. She'd built routines, made acquaintances, learned how to survive without being seen. Coming back as Julia meant reclaiming everything she thought she'd left behind, including the trauma she ran from. Therapists called it re-entry trauma. It's what happens when missing persons are found alive and try to fit back into a space that no longer knows them. And Julia felt it deeply. She had to get used to eating with family again, sleeping without fear, walking into grocery stores without scanning for her abuser. At times, she missed the anonymity of her Rachel days. Despite the hardship, there had been clarity in invisibility. But slowly, she began to heal. Her relationship with her mother grew stronger. They didn't talk about the past unless Julia brought it up. They created new memories, quiet breakfasts, walks by the lake, long silences that said more than words. She started working again, under her real name. First at a bookstore, then part-time at a women's shelter. Ironically, the same kind of place that had helped her survive while missing. And then, nearly 2 years after she returned, she did something no one expected. She spoke publicly, but not to the press. She gave a private talk at a trauma recovery conference under the title "Coming Back Without Going Back: Life After Disappearing." No cameras, no interviews, just her story, told in her voice, to a room full of survivors. Her message was simple but unforgettable. Disappearing didn't save me, but it gave me the space I needed to become someone who could save herself. That line stuck with everyone who heard it. In the end, Julia Robertson wasn't the girl who got lost. She was the woman who found herself, 1 mile, 1 meal, 1 day at a time. And though she never wanted to be a symbol, her quiet return became exactly that. A reminder that surviving isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just choosing to wake up and try again. If this story moved you, don't just scroll away. Someone out there is still missing, still unheard, still hoping to be found. Share this story. Subscribe for more true stories of survival. Comment below. What would you do if someone you loved disappeared? Every view, like, and share helps raise awareness, because sometimes telling the story is the first step toward bringing someone home.